Socrates, the barefoot philosopher of Athens, changed the course of human history by willingly drinking a cup of poison rather than silencing his mind. There are people who change the world by the force of arms, conquering empires. There are those who change it by the force of their genius, creating immortal works of art. And there are those who change the world by the force of a single, simple, but devastating question. His name was Socrates. He was no king, no general, no artist. He was the son of a stonemason, an ugly and barefoot wanderer who spent his days roaming the noisy squares of ancient Athens, doing something that provoked admiration in some and fury in others. He asked questions. But who really was this man, whom the Oracle of Delphi called the wisest of men, but who himself claimed that he only knew that he knew nothing? Why, unlike all other great philosophers, did he not leave behind a single written line, not a single book? And for what real reason did Athens, the cradle of democracy and freedom of speech, condemn its most famous thinker to death, forcing him to drink a cup of poison? This story is an attempt to unveil the enigma of Socrates. It will chronicle his path through the dusty streets of Athens, his famous conversations in which, like an insistent gadfly, he stung the most self-assured politicians and poets, exposing their ignorance. It will witness one of the most famous trials in history, and, finally, it will show how a man who valued truth above his own life faced his death with calm and dignity, turning his execution into his last and most important lesson. This is not a story about facts and dates. It is the story of the birth of philosophy itself, of the power of critical thinking, and of how a single man, armed only with his voice and his reason, taught the entire Western civilization the most important thing: to doubt. Our story begins in Athens, around the year 470 BC. The city, at that time, was at the peak of its power and cultural splendor. It was the golden age of Pericles. The Greeks had recently won a triumphant victory in the wars against the vast Persian Empire. Athens was not just the richest and strongest polis of Hellas, it was its intellectual and spiritual heart. It was here, on the ruins of the ancient city destroyed by the Persians, that the majestic Parthenon was erected. Here, Sophocles and Euripides performed their tragedies. Here, the great sculptors and artists created their works. It seemed that the very air of Athens was infused with ideas, debates, art, and a sense of the limitless possibilities of the human mind. In this bustling and self-confident city, into the family of a simple stonemason named Sophroniscus and a midwife, Phaenaret, a boy was born. They named him Socrates. We know very little about his childhood and youth. Unlike the aristocrats, whose lives were documented in detail, the life of a simple craftsman rarely interested historians. We know that, most likely, he received the basic education available to an Athenian citizen. He learned to read, to write, and to count. And, as was customary, he followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a sculptor or stonemason. Some ancient authors even claimed that, in his youth, he sculpted the statues of the three Graces, which stood for a long time at the entrance to the Acropolis. But much more important was what he saw around him. He grew up not in the silence of a philosophical school, but in the hustle and bustle of urban life. His university was the Agora of Athens, the main marketplace, where everything important happened. Here business deals were closed, politicians spoke, poets gathered, and the sophists debated. Socrates absorbed this atmosphere, listening to these endless debates, observing how easily people tossed around high concepts like justice, goodness, beauty, or virtue, often without understanding their true meaning. The physical appearance of Socrates was far from the Greek ideal of beauty. On the contrary, all sources, even the most friendly, describe him as a surprisingly ugly man. A broad and flat nose, thick lips, bulging eyes. They compared him to a satyr or a Silenus, a forest deity, a companion of Dionysus. He was robust, strongly built, and always walked barefoot, both in winter and summer, wearing the same simple, coarse clothing. This image of a man of the people, who despised outward luxury, would become an important part of his philosophical persona. Like any Athenian citizen, he was a soldier. Socrates participated in the Peloponnesian War, a prolonged and bloody conflict between Athens and Sparta. And here, in battle, this strange and ugly philosopher revealed himself as an incredibly brave and resilient hoplite, a heavy infantry soldier. His disciples, Xenophon and Alcibiades, who served with him, remembered with admiration how he bravely endured hunger and cold. How at the Battle of Potidaea he saved the life of a wounded Alcibiades, carrying him on his shoulders off the battlefield, and later declined the well-deserved medal for bravery in his favor. On another occasion, during the catastrophic retreat of the Athenians after the Battle of Delium, Socrates, unlike his comrades who fled in a panic, retreated with calm and dignity, scaring off the enemies with his fierce look. These episodes prove that his philosophy was not mere abstract speculation. His inner peace and courage were forged in real and deadly dangerous trials. And at some point, already in his maturity, Socrates abandoned his trade as a stonemason. We do not know what caused this. Perhaps he received a small inheritance that allowed him not to work. Perhaps he was supported by wealthy friends and disciples. But the fact is that he dedicated the rest of his life to what he himself called the examination of souls. He did not open a school. He did not charge for his teachings. He did not write books. His method was different. He simply walked. He walked through the agora, the gymnasiums, the workshops, the houses of his friends, and he talked to people, with anyone, politicians, poets, craftsmen, the youth. He would approach a person considered an expert in some field and ask a simple, almost naive question. He might approach a famous general and ask, "Tell me, what is bravery?" The general, smiling, would give the obvious answer. "Bravery is not retreating in battle." Socrates would nod, but immediately ask another question. "And are not the Scythian warriors brave, who first retreat to lure the enemy and then attack? So, sometimes bravery is retreating?" The general would get confused. He would try to give a new definition. But Socrates, with more and more questions, step by step, would show him that in reality he did not know what bravery was, even though all his life he had considered himself the embodiment of it. This method, which would later be called Socratic irony and maieutic, the art of giving birth, was his main tool. He, just like his midwife mother, did not shove knowledge into his interlocutor's head. He helped knowledge be born in their own soul, through the painful process of becoming aware of their own ignorance. His goal was not to humiliate, but to awaken the person. He compared himself to a gadfly, assigned by the gods to the great but lazy horse that was the Athenian state. His task was to sting, to agitate, to not let people sink into complacency and the illusion of knowledge. He believed that philosophy was not a set of ready-made truths, but a continuous, lifelong process of searching. And this search began with one step, the most important of all, the recognition that I only know that I know nothing. To understand why the figure of Socrates, that ugly, barefoot wanderer, shook the foundations of the ancient world so deeply, and why he is remembered millennia later, it is necessary to understand his unique and revolutionary method. It was not simply a way of conversing, it was a whole philosophical system, a true revolution in thought that forever changed the way we seek the truth. Before Socrates, most Greek philosophers, the so-called philosophers of nature or pre-Socratics, were absorbed in the mysteries of the universe. Their minds were directed outward. They were concerned with global and cosmic questions. What is the world made of? Is water its foundation, as Thales believed? Or air, as Anaximenes claimed? Or perhaps everything is made up of tiny, indivisible atoms, as Democritus suggested? They looked at the stars, trying to unravel the laws of the movement of the planets. They observed nature, seeking the primary cause of all things. They were great minds, but their philosophy was far removed from the daily life of the common man. Socrates, on the other hand, carried out what would later be called the anthropological turn in philosophy. In the words of Cicero, he brought philosophy down from heaven to earth. His main and only object of study was not the cosmos, but man. Not the outside world, but the inner world. He did not care what the stars were made of. He was deeply concerned with other, much more earthly questions. What is justice? What is goodness? What is evil? What is love? What is knowledge? how to live life correctly. He redirected the focus from the philosophy of nature to ethics, from physics to psychology. But how do you investigate such abstract concepts? Socrates chose the only path that, in his opinion, was possible: the living dialogue. He refused on principle to give lectures from a podium surrounded by reverent disciples. He did not write multi-volume treatises in which he would lay out his system. He believed that true and authentic knowledge cannot be transmitted from the outside, like merchandise that can be bought, or an instruction that can be learned. It can only be born within the person themselves, as a result of their own painful intellectual efforts. And his task as a philosopher was not to teach, but to help in that birth. This unique process, he himself, with his characteristic irony, called maeutics, or the art of midwifery, comparing himself directly to his mother, the midwife Phanerate. She, he said, helped bodies come into the world. He helped thoughts, hidden in the souls of his interlocutors, to be born. The process was complex, consisted of several stages, and was often quite painful for the one giving birth. It all began with the so-called Socratic irony. Socrates, like a hunter, would look in the Athenian crowd for a person who had a reputation as an expert in some field. It could be a celebrated general, convinced that he knew perfectly well what bravery was, or an influential politician who every day spoke from the tribune about justice, or a famous poet, persuaded that he had understood the very nature of beauty. Socrates would approach such an expert, looking like a naive, simple-minded, almost foolish ignoramus. He would say, "Oh, great Laches, all of Athens knows you as the bravest of warriors, but I am a simple man, and I do not understand many things. Be so kind, take pity on my ignorance, and explain to me, what exactly is bravery?" The politician, or the general, flattered by such attention and somewhat condescending toward this strange barefoot eccentric, would easily give him the ready-made, commonly accepted, and superficial definition. For example, bravery, O Socrates, is very simple. It is when a soldier stays in formation and does not retreat before the enemy. And here began the second and most important stage of the method, the elenchus, or the refutation. Socrates seemed to be delighted. "A magnificent and clear answer," he would exclaim. "But allow me to ask a small clarifying question, so that I, in my clumsiness, may better understand your wisdom." And he would ask a question that, at first glance, seemed harmless, but which revealed the internal contradiction of that definition. Of course, staying in formation is brave. But tell me, are the Scythian horse archers, who first fake a retreat to lure the enemy into a trap, and then turn around and cover them with arrows, not brave warriors? So, does it turn out that sometimes bravery is precisely knowing how to retreat in time? The interlocutor would immediately find themselves in a tight spot. They were forced to agree. They would get confused. They would try to correct their initial definition, add exceptions and caveats to it. Well, they would say, then bravery is a kind of reasonable perseverance. "Excellent," Socrates would reply. "But if a doctor, knowing that a patient is a lost cause, still perseveres in treating them and spending their money, is that reasonable perseverance, bravery, or rather shamelessness? And if a man persistently invests in a risky venture that is doomed to fail, is that bravery or stupidity?" Step by step, question after question, Socrates, with new and more examples from daily life, like an experienced surgeon, exposed all the weak points, all the logical inconsistencies in his opponent's reasoning. His goal was not to humiliate the person, although many perceived it exactly like that, feeling publicly gutted. His goal was to bring the interlocutor to a state of aporia, a complete intellectual dead end, confusion, stupor. Socrates wanted the person, who was absolutely and complacently sure of their knowledge, to suddenly realize with horror and shame that in reality they knew nothing. For them to utter that saving and healing phrase, "By Zeus, Socrates, I do not know what to answer. You have scrambled all my thoughts." It was precisely this moment, the moment of the painful and shocking recognition of one's own ignorance, that Socrates considered the true beginning of philosophy. Only one who has understood that they know nothing acquires a genuine and passionate thirst for knowledge. His famous and paradoxical maxim, I only know that I know nothing must be understood exactly in this sense. It was not coquetry or false modesty. It was his fundamental philosophical position. Compared to others, who believe they know but in reality do not know, he, at least, is aware of his ignorance, and that alone already makes him wiser than all of them. And only after the patient had been brought to the state of aporia, when their old and false knowledge had been completely destroyed, did the third and constructive stage of maeutics begin, the joint search for a new definition, more precise and free of contradictions. And here, Socrates never gave ready-made answers. He continued asking questions, but now not destructive ones, but guiding ones, helping the interlocutor build for themselves, step by step, from the rubble of their old ideas, a new and more solid edifice of knowledge. This method was incredibly effective for some and unbearably irritating for others. The talented and curious youth, like his future great disciple Plato, was absolutely fascinated. They saw in Socrates a unique teacher who did not impose his opinion, but awakened their own minds, forced them to think for themselves. But most of the Athenian authorities, conceited politicians, famous poets, wealthy sophists, saw in him only a dangerous agitator and a biting demagogue. He mercilessly undermined their reputation, publicly demonstrating their intellectual incompetence. He was, as he proudly called himself, the gadfly, assigned by the gods to the noble but lazy and fattened Athenian horse. His task was to sting constantly, to agitate, to not let the city sleep peacefully in the sweet lethargy of complacency. And the horse, as often happens, only dreamed of one thing, swatting away that annoying and buzzing insect with its tail. Thus, the main method of Socrates was intellectual obstetrics, helping the truth be born through the tand of false certainty and the awakening of a sincere thirst for knowledge. But what did he really teach? If he constantly repeated that he knew nothing and never gave ready answers, did he even have any positive doctrine, any set of ideas that he considered true? Yes, he did. But it was not hidden in grandiose statements or in systematic treatises, but in the very direction of his questions, in the themes to which, like an obsessed man, he returned again and again in each of his conversations. It was a teaching not about the physics of the cosmos, but about the architecture of the human soul. The central idea, the axis around which his entire philosophy revolved, was the famous and ancient call inscribed on the pediment of the Temple of Apollo in Delphi: "Know thyself." For Socrates, this phrase was not a simple, beautiful aphorism or a piece of advice for self-reflection. It was the main, unique, and fundamental task of all human life. He was deeply convinced that the vast majority of people, including the most respected citizens of Athens, lived as if they were asleep, in profound ignorance about themselves. They pursue external and illusory goods. Money, which you have today and tomorrow you don't. Fame and honors, which depend on the whims of the crowd. Power, which corrupts and brings more anxiety than peace. In this endless race after shadows, they completely forget the most important thing, the only thing that truly belongs to them, their own soul. They do not know what their soul is, what its nature is, what is a true good for it, and what is a destructive evil. And such a life, an unexamined life, according to his famous expression thrown in the faces of his judges at the trial, is not worth living for a human being. To live without examining oneself is, according to Socrates, to live on an animal level, obeying only instincts and external stimuli. Philosophy for him was not a profession, nor an intellectual hobby. It was a way of waking up, a way of finally starting the greatest of all journeys, the journey into the depths of one's own inner world. But how to investigate it? How to know the soul? Socrates was convinced that the key to everything was knowledge, but he gave this word a very special meaning. It was not the knowledge of many facts, not the erudition that so many sophists took pride in. It was the knowledge of the essence of things. First of all, of the essence of fundamental ethical concepts. He was literally obsessed with the search for precise, universal, and exhaustive definitions. What is justice in itself, in its pure and ideal form, and not just examples of particular just acts? What is goodness, in general, and not just what is beneficial for me, or for Athens at a given moment? He believed that if a person, with the help of their reason, manage to pierce the fog of opinions and customs and understand this true, universal, and unchanging essence of goodness and justice, it would simply be physically impossible for them to do wrong. Precisely from this conviction is born the most paradoxical, controversial, and important thesis of his entire ethics. No one does evil voluntarily, or in other words, all evil is only a consequence of ignorance. At first glance, this idea seems absurd. Do we not see every day how people commit evil acts consciously? But Socrates looked deeper. He was convinced that any bad act is committed by a person not because they are bad by nature, not because they enjoy evil in itself, but exclusively because they are mistaken in their conception of what is the true good for them. They do not know that, by committing evil, they harm first and foremost not their victim, but themselves, their own soul. The thief does not steal because he loves the act of stealing. He steals because, erroneously and ignorantly, he believes that wealth will bring him happiness and peace. The tyrant does not execute his opponents because he likes to see blood, but because, ignorantly, he believes that this will strengthen his power and bring him safety and well-being. All of them, according to Socrates, are simply ignorant. They wander in the dark like blind people, confusing illusions with reality. They harm others, yes, but their main victim is their own soul, because every unjust act makes it weaker, uglier, more painful, and ultimately unhappier. From here follows with iron logic his other famous thesis. Virtue is knowledge. Being a good, just, and brave person is not a matter of good manners, nor the result of following traditions or divine commandments. It is above all a matter of knowledge. If you have truly understood, to the bottom, not at the level of opinion, but at the level of essence, what justice is, you simply will not be able to act unjustly. Just as a geometer, who knows what a straight line is, cannot draw a curve sincerely believing it is straight. The path to moral perfection, according to Socrates, is the path of a difficult and continuous intellectual search. The path of philosophy. To be better, one must be smarter, one must know oneself, and the essence of goodness. This idea, the so-called ethical rationalism, was absolutely revolutionary for its time. It completely changed the conception of morality, moving it from the realm of traditions and religion to the realm of reason. Morality is not blindly following rules. Morality is the result of the work of reason, the result of knowledge. Another enigmatic but key part of his teaching was his famous daimonion or inner voice. Socrates claimed that since he was a child, he heard within himself a kind of divine signal, a voice that never ordered him what to do, but that always, with an unwavering insistence, pulled him away from bad or dangerous acts. If he was about to go to the square and the voice fell silent, he went. But if the voice warned him, he stayed home, even if he didn't understand the reason. This daimonion was one of the main targets of his accusers at the trial, who saw in it the introduction of new deities not recognized by the state. But for Socrates himself, it was rather the manifestation of his sharpened and perfected intuition, the voice of his conscience, his deepest and almost mystical connection with his inner self. This inner voice was for him the supreme and unquestionable authority, more important than the opinion of the crowd, than the decisions of the popular assembly, or even than the laws of the state. It symbolized his faith that inside every person there is a kind of divine compass that, if listened to, if the mind is cleared of the noise of passions and prejudices, will always point the right way. Socrates was a deeply religious man, but his religion did not lie in formal rituals and lavish sacrifices, which he often mocked. He believed in a single, good, and supra-rational demiurge God who had created the world not in a chaotic way, but according to the laws of harmony and order. And the main task of man, in his opinion, was the epimeleia tes psyches, the care of the soul, making it better, purer, more rational, thus getting closer to the divine design. In this consisted the essence of his teaching, without a doctrine. He did not give ready answers. He did not create a finished system. He gave humanity a method and a direction. The method is relentless self-analysis through dialogue, and the direction is the turn from the external and material world towards the internal and spiritual one. from the pursuit of things to the care of the soul. He didn't teach what to think, but how to think. And this lesson, this simple but infinitely complex demand, know thyself, became his main and immortal contribution to the history of human thought, the activity of Socrates. His daily, hours-long conversations in the streets and squares of Athens could not go unnoticed. This strange and ugly philosopher, who, unlike the fashionable sophists, did not charge for his lessons, but tortured with his relentless questions the most respected and conceited citizens, quickly became one of the most famous, discussed, and controversial figures in the city. Athenian society, so proud of its freedom of speech, was divided. For some, mainly for the curious and thinking youth, he became an idol, a true teacher, the living embodiment of wisdom and moral purity. For others, for the majority of those who held power, wealth, and authority, he was a dangerous agitator, a biting idler, a gadfly, who undermined the foundations and corrupted minds. The first to be drawn to him were, of course, the young people, mainly talented and restless young men from the most noble aristocratic families. They no longer felt satisfied with the old traditional values of their fathers. They were neither attracted by the military career, based on brute force, nor the political career in its cynical and pragmatic form, where the main goal was the ability to manipulate the crowd. Their minds, awakened by the great tragedies and philosophical debates, sought something more, an unchanging truth, an absolute meaning, a real and not apparent knowledge, and they found it in the strange and fascinating conversations with Socrates. The most brilliant and devoted of his disciples was, without a doubt, Plato, a young aristocrat, a descendant of the ancient kings of Athens, who in his youth dreamed of being a tragic poet, an Olympic wrestling champion, or an influential politician. But, upon meeting Socrates and listening to his dialogues, according to legend, he burned all his youthful poems and dedicated himself completely and forever to philosophy. For Plato, Socrates was not just a teacher, he was an ideal, the ideal of the philosopher, the ideal of the man who lives in absolute consistency with his convictions, and for whom truth is more valuable than fame, wealth, and life itself. It is thanks to Plato, to his immortal dialogues, where Socrates is the main character, that today we know, in essence, his doctrine. Plato did not simply transcribe his teacher's conversations. He turned him into a literary hero, a symbol of the philosophical quest, putting into his mouth the development and deepening of his own already Platonic ideas. Another important disciple who left us invaluable testimonies was Xenophon. Unlike Plato, inclined to metaphysics and idealism, Xenophon was a man of action, a career military man, a general, a historian, a pragmatist to the core. In his Memorabilia of Socrates, he paints a completely different and much more earthly picture of his teacher. Not a sublime philosopher soaring in the world of ideas, but a wise, practical, somewhat ironic, and very sensible advisor. Xenophon's Socrates gives useful advice on how to manage a household, how to be a good citizen, how to properly raise children, how to choose friends. These two portraits, the metaphysical Socrates of Plato and the practical Socrates of Xenophon, are like two mirrors that reflect different but equally important facets of this complex and multifaceted personality. But the most brilliant, most scandalous, and, ultimately, most fatal disciple for Socrates' reputation was Alcibiades, a man of great beauty, descended from the most noble lineage, incredibly talented, charismatic, a brilliant orator and general, but at the same time absolutely unprincipled, vain, and immoral. Alcibiades was the golden boy of Athens, its hope and its curse. Socrates was the only one capable of making this spoiled and narcissistic young man blush with shame for his unworthy life, as he himself confesses in Plato's Symposium. He sincerely admired the intelligence and moral strength of Socrates. He was drawn to his wisdom, but his thirst for power, for fame, for wealth, and for endless pleasures was stronger. Later on, having become one of the leaders of Athens, Alcibiades will commit numerous political adventures and treasons. He will defect to the side of their archenemies, the Spartans, and will cause immense damage to his hometown. And later, at the trial, it will be precisely this friendship with Alcibiades that will be one of the main, although not explicit, charges against Socrates. "Look at who you have raised," his enemies will shout. "You taught him to despise the laws and traditions." This brilliant youth, like shadows, followed Socrates everywhere. They listened to his conversations in the agora. They admired his irony. They learned his relentless method of analysis. And, to the horror of their conservative fathers, they began to apply this method at home. They would approach their fathers, respected Athenian citizens, and begin asking them Socratic questions. "Father, you say you know what justice is. Explain it to me then. What is its essence?" This caused family conflicts and scandals. The parents complained that this atheist Socrates was leading their children astray. He was teaching them not to respect their elders, to doubt the sacred traditions of their ancestors, to question the authority of the state and the gods. But the enemies of Socrates were not just the angry parents. His main and most influential opponents were the sophists. They were professional teachers of wisdom, very expensive and itinerant, who for large sums of money taught the wealthy youth the art of rhetoric, the skill to speak convincingly, to win debates, and to triumph in the courts, often regardless of who was right. Socrates despised them with all his soul. He believed that they did not trade in knowledge, but in the appearance of knowledge. Not in the truth, but in success. And he demolished them mercilessly, publicly, in front of their own students, in philosophical duels, proving with his method all the emptiness, shallowness, and contradiction of their reasoning. The sophists, who were losing students, reputation, and consequently money, hated him with a fierce and professional hatred. They were gladly joined by the politicians, especially the leaders of the Democratic Party. These men came to power thanks to their ability to speak eloquently and to please the fickle Athenian crowd. Socrates, on the other hand, taught the youth to think critically, not to believe in grandiose words, to seek the essence behind the beautiful facade, to distinguish true knowledge from simple opinion. A thinking and doubting electorate was of no use to them. It was dangerous. And, finally, the poets and tragic playwrights, considered in Athens as the bearers of the highest wisdom. Socrates, in his dialogues, proved that poets created not out of knowledge, but out of inspiration, out of a kind of divine inspiration, and that often they themselves could not explain the meaning of what they wrote. For authors who considered themselves teachers of the people, this was a deadly insult. The comedic playwright Aristophanes, one of the greatest dramatists of his time, in his famous comedy The Clouds, presented Socrates as the main character, a caricatured charlatan floating in the clouds, a fraud and sophist, who for money taught young men to make the unjust cause seem just and to not pay their debts. This image, although absolutely unfair, Socrates, unlike the sophists, never charged money, stuck firmly in the minds of many simple Athenians who were not well versed in philosophy. Thus, year after year, the circle of his enemies grew, became denser and more influential. He was like a constant thorn in the side of Athenian society. He irritated, bothered, cast doubt on everything people were used to believing in. And as long as Athens was strong, rich, and confident, a blind eye was turned to this strange and barefoot eccentric, to this town fool. But the times were changing. The tragic end of the Golden Age was approaching, and in an atmosphere of impending military defeats, political crisis, and moral decay, the city's patience towards its main and relentless gadfly was running out. The end of the 5th century BC was for Athens a time of the greatest convulsions. The Golden Age of Pericles was over. The long and exhausting Peloponnesian War against Sparta ended in a total and crushing defeat for Athens. The city lost its fleet, its colonies, its power. Democracy was temporarily overthrown, and the brutal regime of the 30 tyrants was established in the city, drowning Athens in blood. Then democracy was restored, but it was no longer the confident and prosperous democracy of before. It was a regime poisoned by distrust, fear, the bitterness of defeat, and the craving to find culprits. And in this atmosphere of a witch hunt, the figure of Socrates, who for decades had criticized the foundations of Athenian society, became the perfect target. He had never been directly involved in politics, but among his disciples were both critics of democracy, and even some of those who had collaborated with the regime of the 30 tyrants, including the infamous Critias. For the restored democracy Socrates was the living symbol of that critical spirit, of that doubt in the foundations, which in the eyes of many had led Athens to catastrophe. In the year 399 BC, 3 Athenian citizens, the poet Meletus, the wealthy tanner Anytus, and the orator Lycon, brought a formal accusation against Socrates, who was already 70 years old. It was brief, but deadly dangerous. The accusation consisted of 3 points. Socrates was accused that, first, he does not honor the gods that the city honors, but introduces new divinities. Second, he corrupts the youth. And third, implicitly, he poses a threat to the stability of the state. Let's analyze what lay behind these formal charges. The accusation of not honoring the gods was the most serious. Athens was a religious state, and asabeia, or impiety, was punishable by death. The accusers referred to Socrates' famous daimonion, his inner voice. They claimed that this was the new deity he was introducing, placing it above the traditional Olympian gods. Furthermore, his rational and critical approach to the world, his constant questions of why, seemed to many an undermining of faith in traditional myths. The charge of corrupting the youth was even more insidious. It aimed at the very heart of his activity. The accusers gathered around them all those disgruntled fathers whose sons, after listening to Socrates, began to argue with their elders and to doubt authorities. They pointed to the scandalous figures who had once been in his circle, primarily the traitor Alcibiades. "These are the fruits of your education," they shouted. "You teach them to despise the laws, to laugh at the traditions, to not respect their parents." For the crowd, which sought simple answers to complex questions, this logic was very convincing. The trial of Socrates took place in the Heliaea, the jury court of Athens. The judges were not professional lawyers, but 501 Athenian citizens chosen by lot. It was, in essence, a trial by the mob. The decision depended not so much on legal evidence as on the art of oratory, on the ability to win the favor of that mass of people. Socrates had the opportunity to prepare. His friends begged him to hire a professional orator, a logographer, to write him a brilliant defense speech, but Socrates disdainfully refused. He said that his whole life had been a preparation for that day, and that he would defend himself, speaking only the truth and not what the crowd wanted to hear. The trial began with the intervention of the accusers. Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon delivered their speeches, full of demagoguery, distorted facts, and direct attacks. They painted the picture of Socrates as a dangerous sophist, an atheist who, with his poisonous skepticism, destroyed the moral foundations of society and paved the way for tyranny. Then Socrates was given the floor, and his speech, which we know thanks to Plato's version titled The Apology of Socrates. Apology in this case does not mean saying sorry, but a speech of defense, became one of the greatest documents in the history of human thought. He did not justify himself. He did not flatter the judges. He did not ask for mercy. Instead, he turned his defense into his last and most important philosophical sermon. Calmly and methodically, using his characteristic style, he took apart all the accusations. He proved that he had never charged for his teachings, unlike the sophists. He proved that he had never taught atheism, but that, on the contrary, he had always spoken of his faith in divine providence. As for corrupting the youth, he asked with irony, if he had corrupted anyone, why had none of his corrupted disciples or their parents come to court today to testify against him? But the main part of his speech was not dedicated to refuting the accusations, but to explaining the meaning of his entire life. He told the story of his friend who asked the oracle of Delphi if there was anyone wiser than Socrates, and the oracle answered that there was not. Socrates, in his own words, was perplexed, for he knew that he knew nothing, and then he decided to put the god's words to the test. He began to walk and converse with those considered wise, politicians, poets, craftsmen, and he understood what their wisdom consisted of. All these people, knowing nothing, believed they knew a lot, but he, knowing nothing, at least was aware of his own ignorance. He explained that his mission, entrusted by the god Apollo himself, was to be the gadfly of the Athenian state, to wake people up from their intellectual lethargy, to make them think, to care not about money and fame, but about the perfection of their soul. "Athenians," he said, "are you not ashamed to care for the acquisition of wealth and for reputation and honor, when you neither care nor take thought for wisdom and truth and the perfection of your soul?" This speech was brilliant, but for a trial by mob, it was suicidal. The judges expected repentance from him, and they received a philosophy lesson. They expected flattery, and they received irony. By a majority of votes, although by a narrow margin, Socrates was found guilty. According to Athenian procedure, after the guilty verdict came a second phase. Both the prosecution and the convicted man had to propose a penalty. The judges then chose one of the two. The accusers, sure of their victory, demanded the death penalty. This was the moment when Socrates could have saved his life. It would have been enough for him to propose a large fine as an alternative. His wealthy friends, including Plato, were ready to pay it immediately or to accept voluntary exile from Athens. And most likely, the judges would have accepted. But Socrates remained true to himself. He said that he did not consider himself guilty, but on the contrary, the greatest benefactor of Athens. And therefore, as a punishment, he proposed what, in his opinion, he deserved: to be maintained for life in the Prytaneum, at the expense of the state, an honor reserved only for Olympic champions. This was an unheard of insult to the court. The judges, even those who initially sympathized with him, were infuriated by such arrogance. In the second vote, many more people voted for the death penalty than had voted for the guilty verdict. The sentence was passed. Socrates was condemned to death. After the death sentence was handed down, Socrates was not executed immediately. By a strange, almost mystical coincidence, his death was postponed for almost a month. It turns out that, on the eve of the trial, the state ship had departed from Athens to the sacred island of Delos with the annual embassy in honor of the god Apollo. And according to an ancient Athenian law, from the moment this ship departed until its return, the city had to remain pure, and no capital execution could be carried out. Thus, Socrates gained 30 more days of life. He did not spend them in despair or in fear, but in the same way he had lived, conversing with his friends, reflecting and seeking the truth. He was transferred to the state prison, the Desmotarion. It was not a dungeon, but rather a guarded room. Free access was allowed to his friends and disciples, who spent whole days with him, from dawn to dusk. It was in this last month that the events described by Plato in two of his greatest dialogues, Crito and Phaedo, took place. Socrates' friends, wealthy and influential men, could not resign themselves to the sentence. They devised a detailed escape plan. One of his oldest and most faithful friends, Crito, goes to his cell before dawn. He tells him that everything is ready. The guards are bribed. A ship waits in the harbor. A refuge in Thessaly has already been found. He begs him. He implores Socrates to flee. He tells him that if Socrates dies, everyone will blame him, Crito, and the other friends, for not having saved their teacher out of greed or cowardice. He appeals to his paternal duty, since Socrates leaves behind small children. But Socrates, calm and imperturbable, does not answer him with emotions, but with his characteristic method, with questions. He initiates the famous dialogue on the nature of laws and justice. "Tell me, Crito," he says, "what is more important, the opinion of the majority or the opinion of one alone? But who knows?" Crito agrees that the opinion of the one who knows is more important. "Good," continues Socrates, "and if an athlete who wants to win listens to the advice not of his coach, but of the ignorant crowd, will that bring him a benefit or a harm?" Crito agrees that it will cause him harm. "Then why," asks Socrates, "when it comes to the most important thing, not the body, but the soul, to justice and injustice, should we listen to the opinion of the crowd and not the voice of reason and the law?" Then he asks Crito to imagine that, at the moment of his escape, the very laws of Athens appear before them and address him, Socrates, with a speech. "Socrates, what have you planned? Do you not, by your escape, destroy us, the laws, and the whole state? Can a state survive where judicial decisions have no force, but are annulled and destroyed by private individuals?" He explains to Crito that he, Socrates, has lived in Athens for 70 years. He has never left the city. except during military campaigns. He has voluntarily enjoyed all the benefits that these laws have granted him. He has married, has had and raised his children according to these laws. He has never tried to change them, and now that these same laws, although applied unjustly, have handed down a sentence upon him, does he have the right, like a spoiled child, to break his contract with the state? To act unjustly, says Socrates, is always, and in all cases, an evil and a disgrace. Even if they have been unjust to you, responding to injustice with injustice is an evil. Escaping, in his opinion, would be precisely an unjust response. It would prove that he himself does not believe in the principles he has taught his whole life. He preferred to die remaining true to his convictions than to live betraying them. Crito, with tears in his eyes, was forced to nod. He was disarmed, not by force, but by logic. The day of the execution, described in the dialogue Phaedo, was the last day of philosophical conversations. The disciples, gathered in his cell, were in despair. But Socrates was surprisingly calm and even cheerful. He comforted them, telling them that a philosopher who has prepared his whole life for death should not fear its arrival. The main topic of his last conversation was the immortality of the soul. Socrates, using complex logical and metaphysical arguments, tries to prove to his disciples that the soul does not die with the body. He says that the body is the prison of the soul, the source of passions, diseases, and ignorance. And death is the liberation, the moment when the pure soul, freed from bodily ties, can finally come into direct contact with the world of eternal ideas, with the world of truth. He speaks of how only those who are too attached to bodily pleasures can fear death. But the true philosopher, on the contrary, spends his whole life practicing how to die. That is, he tries to rise above his body, to purify his soul through reason. This dialogue is not a rigorous scientific theory, but rather a poetic and philosophical consolation that the dying master offers his grieving disciples. He does not so much prove as instill hope. When the sun began to set, a servant entered the cell with a cup in his hands. With tears in his eyes, he said that Socrates was the noblest of all who had been in that prison, and asked him not to curse him for having to carry out an order. Socrates calmly took the cup of hemlock poison. He asked if he could pour a libation to the gods, but they answered that the amount of poison was just exactly what was needed. Then, simply, without any disgust or trembling, he raised the cup to his lips and drank it to the last drop. His disciples, who up to that moment had held back, could no longer take it and burst into tears. Socrates gently rebuked them. "What are you doing, strange men? This is exactly why I sent the women away, so there would be no such scenes." He stood up, and following the executioner's advice, began to walk around the cell so that the poison would spread faster through his body. When his legs began to feel heavy, he lay down. The servant, checking the effect of the poison, pinched his foot, but Socrates no longer felt anything. The cold was slowly rising from his feet towards his heart. His last words, already spoken softly and addressed to Crito, were a strange phrase that still provokes debate today. "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Do not forget to pay it." Asclepius was the god of medicine. By tradition, a person who recovered from an illness sacrificed a rooster to him in gratitude for their healing. Perhaps Socrates meant that death is the healing of the soul from the illness called life. An instant later, he lay motionless. Crito approached and closed his eyes and mouth. Thus, before the eyes of his disciples, calmly and with total dignity, died the man whom Plato would call the wisest, the most just, and the best of all the men we knew. The death of Socrates was not the end, but the true birth of his philosophy. If in life he was just a strange and well-known Athenian eccentric in small circles, after his death as a martyr, he became a symbol, the eternal symbol of the philosopher, of the wise man, of the man who put truth and conscience before his own life. The execution, which was supposed to silence him forever, actually made his voice immortal. The reaction of Athens to his death was ambivalent and changed over time. Immediately after the execution, his enemies celebrated, but very soon, according to historians, the Athenians repented. They understood that they had committed a monstrous mistake by executing their wisest citizen. A persecution against his accusers began. Meletus, according to one version, was sentenced to death. Anytus was exiled, but that could no longer bring Socrates back. His true immortality, however, began in the works of his disciples. Socrates, who did not write a single line, became the most quoted and discussed philosopher of antiquity. Immediately after his death, a whole series of so-called Socratic schools emerged. Each of them took one facet of his complex and contradictory doctrine and developed it. The Cynics, like Antisthenes, took his asceticism and his contempt for material goods, taking them to the extreme. The Cyrenaics, on the contrary, developed his ideas on goodness towards hedonism, the doctrine of pleasure. But the main and true heir of Socrates was, of course, Plato. The death of his teacher moved him so much that he dedicated his entire life to the mission of preserving and reflecting on his legacy. In almost all of his brilliant dialogues, Plato makes Socrates the main character. And although, over time, Plato's Socrates begins to express purely Platonic ideas about the world of ideas, about the state of philosophers, the image itself, the method itself, the very spirit of Socrates, the spirit of the relentless dialectical search for truth, was preserved by him forever. It was through Plato that Socrates' ideas were passed on to his disciple Aristotle, and Aristotle, in turn, became the teacher of Alexander the Great. Thus, the invisible thread of Socratic thought stretched across generations, shaping the entire intellectual landscape of antiquity. With the fall of the ancient world, it seemed that the figure of Socrates was bound to fade into the background. But that was not the case. The early Christian thinkers, like Justin Martyr, saw in Socrates a Christian before Christ. His monotheism, his doctrine on the soul, his death as a martyr for his convictions, all made his figure incredibly close to the Christian worldview. In the Islamic world, he was revered as the greatest of sages, a precursor of the prophets. Arab philosophers translated and commented on Plato's works, and therefore the dialogues of Socrates, preserving them for the Western world during the Dark Ages. The new and triumphant return of Socrates to European culture took place in the Renaissance. The humanists, upon rediscovering antiquity, saw in Socrates their ideal, the free, independent, and critically thinking man, who places reason and personal conscience above any external authority, be it the state or the church. During the Enlightenment, Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot praised him as a fighter against tyranny, dogmatism, and ignorance. His trial and execution became for them the symbol of the eternal conflict between free reason and repressive power. And this relevance has not disappeared today. The image of Socrates remains alive in our culture. Philosophers, writers, and film directors turn to him. His method, the Socratic dialogue, is still used in pedagogy, in psychotherapy, in business training, as one of the best ways to stimulate critical thinking and find unconventional solutions. So, what is his main and immortal contribution? He did not build a scientific system like Aristotle. He did not create a metaphysical theory like Plato. His legacy is not in the answers. His legacy is in the questions. He taught humanity the most important thing, the art of asking questions. First of all, to oneself. He transformed philosophy from a science about the stars into a science about man. He proved that the path to wisdom begins with a simple but very difficult step, the recognition of one's own ignorance, and that the main goal of life is not the accumulation of wealth, but the ceaseless care of the soul. His life and his death became an eternal reminder that ideas have consequences, that the path to truth often requires courage, and that a single man, armed only with his reason and his conscience, can truly change the world, not by the force of arms, but by the force of the word, by the force of a question asked at the right time. And that question, know thyself, continues to echo across the millennia, addressed to each one of us. If you found this journey into the mind of Socrates valuable, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let us know in the comments what you think about his method. Do you think you could pass the Socratic test?